Program in the cotton industry with a group of Africa's 4 major cotton-producing countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali. China will help with their infrastructure building and technical training to boost cotton production. The agreement is a follow-up to a program that started in 2011 at the 8th WTO Ministerial Conference. That's when China first committed to supporting the so-called Cotton 4 via technical and financial aid in the sector.
Farmers are waiting to hear the details of what could be a financial lifeline as farm bankruptcies this year are surging.
China sharply raised the stakes overnight in President Trump's trade war after he increased U.S. tariffs on Chinese products to 145% yesterday. Now, China's president is hitting back, increasing Beijing's 84% tariff on U.S. goods to 125% starting tomorrow.
America is losing the cotton war and nobody is talking about it, not on the news, not in Washington, not in the markets where it matters most. And while attention is focused elsewhere, contracts are quietly shifting away from U.S. producers, warehouses are filling, prices are softening, and farmers who once supplied the world are discovering they're no longer the first call. This isn't about drought or bad seasons, it's about strategy. Africa has built new supply chains. China has locked in long-term partnerships together. They've changed how cotton moves, how it's priced, and who controls the future of the industry. And the United States is watching it happen in slow motion. Subsidies can delay the pain, but they can't reverse the shift, because once buyers stop depending on you and leverage disappears, and this isn't just a farming story, it's a warning about what happens when dominance is assumed instead of defended.
Well, it turns out tariffs on China have failed bigly. Trump told us that sanctions and tariffs were going to bring China to its knees, that if the U.S. just got tough enough, China's economy would crack. But according to Goldman Sachs, the exact opposite happened. Take a look at this. China's economy is forecast to grow faster than expected in 2026. Okay, this isn't coming from Beijing. This isn't Chinese state media. This is Goldman Sachs, one of the most powerful financial institutions on.
If you've been at the store looking for certain products recently, you may already know about an ongoing cotton shortage. It's impacting everything from clothing to beauty supplies.
The warning signs appeared quietly, buried in trade data and seasonal forecasts, but few in the United States wanted to read them. Cotton had always been a pillar of American agriculture, a crop tied not just to economics, but to identity, scale, and global reach. For generations, American cotton moved confidently through international markets, priced competitively, shipped efficiently, and protected by reputation. Then Africa and China began changing the rules. It did not start with confrontation. There were no press conferences or dramatic announcements. Instead, contracts shifted, buyers diversified, logistics routes adjusted. By the time American farmers noticed declining demand, the momentum had already moved elsewhere. Africa's cotton-producing countries had been investing quietly for years. Infrastructure improved, processing capacity expanded, quality control tightened. What once left African ports as raw fiber increasingly stayed within the continent longer, gaining value before export. This was not accidental, it was strategic. China watched closely. For decades, China had relied heavily on American cotton, valuing its consistency and scale. But reliance was never loyalty. As trade relationships grew more complex, China sought insulation. Africa offered exactly that. Long-term supply agreements emerged. Investment flowed into African ginning facilities. Transportation corridors were optimized. China did not replace American cotton overnight. It reduced exposure gradually. Methodically and decisively, the result was subtle but devastating. American cotton remained abundant, but abundance without buyers became a liability. Warehouses filled, prices softened, margins shrank. Farmers who had expanded acreage during years of strong demand found themselves over-leveraged when contracts failed to renew. Africa, meanwhile, felt a surge of confidence. Cotton-producing countries across the continents or renewed relevance. Instead of competing solely on volume, they competed on integration. Cotton was no longer just an export. It was an industry anchor supporting textiles, employment, and domestic manufacturing. This shift altered power dynamics. In the past, Africa's cotton was often underpriced on global markets, constrained by limited bargaining power. Now, with China willing to invest beyond raw procurement, Africa negotiated from strength. Price floors stabilized, supply certainty improved. The volatility that once plagued African producers softened. The United States struggled to adapt. American cotton had been built for a world where scale guaranteed demand. That world was changing. China's diversification meant American producers were no longer indispensable. And Africa's rise meant competition was no longer confined to quality alone, but to partnership. American farmers felt the impact unevenly but intensely. Large producers absorbed losses temporarily, relying on reserves and credit. Smaller farmers faced harsher realities. Equipment payments loomed, land values stagnated, banks tightened. Lending, what had once been a predictable cycle, turned uncertain. The phrase "going broke" circulated not as exaggeration but as fear. This was not caused by drought or pest. It was caused by market displacement. Africa did not celebrate American hardship. It barely noticed it. From Africa's perspective, this was overdue correction. For decades, African cotton had competed against subsidized production from wealthy nations. Prices were suppressed, growth was constrained. Now, with China valuing stability and proximity over tradition, Africa's position strengthened. China framed its strategy as diversification. Africa framed it as emancipation. The United States framed it as disruption. Each perspective reflected a different reality. China reduced dependency. Risk, Africa increased value capture. The United States lost leverage it assumed permanent. What unsettled American policymakers was not just the economic loss, but the speed of normalization. There was no backlash, no urgent renegotiation. Global buyers adjusted calmly. The market accepted the new balance without protest. That silence spoke volumes. Cotton, once a symbol of American dominance, became another commodity subject. To global recalibration. The United States was no longer the default supplier. It was one option among many. Africa's cotton producers understood the stakes. They invested further. Research programs improved yields. Training expanded. Sustainability narratives strengthened appeal to global buyers sensitive to ethics and traceability. Africa did not chase volume alone, it chased relevance. China reinforced the trend by integrating African cotton into its industrial planning. Textile clusters aligned supply with manufacturing hubs. Logistics efficiency reduced costs. Predictability replaced speculation. American farmers found themselves outside these loops, not excluded by force, but bypassed by design. Attempts to regain ground faced challenges. Price competition alone was insufficient. Relationships mattered. Long-term commitments mattered, policy coherence mattered. Africa offered alignment, China responded. The United States hesitated, domestic debates delayed response. Trade uncertainty lingered, support measures focused on survival rather than repositioning. Farmers waited for markets to rebound, not realizing the market had moved on. Africa's rise in cotton was not explosive, it was consistent. And consistency reshapes industries more effectively than shock. As seasons passed, American farmers recalculated planting decisions. Some reduced acreage, others diversified crops, a few exited entirely. The emotional toll matched the financial one. Generational continuity was questioned. Meanwhile, Africa spoke of cotton as future-facing. Jobs expanded, value chains lengthened, confidence grew. Cotton became not just an export, but a foundation. China continued buying, not exclusively, not sentimentally, but strategically. The crushing of American cotton was not malicious. It was structural. Africa and China did not set out to break American farmers. They set out to secure themselves. The outcome, however, was the same: American. Farmers faced a reality they had never been forced to confront. Dominance was no longer guaranteed, and once that realization set in, the industry understood something irreversible had happened. The cotton world had shifted, and the United States was no longer at its center. As the consequences deepened, the American cotton crisis revealed itself as more than a temporary downturn. It became a stress test for an agricultural model built on historical advantage rather than adaptive strategy. Africa and China were not just competitors. They represented a different logic. In the United States, cotton production had long relied on predictability. Established buyers, familiar logistics, stable financing, that predictability dissolved quietly. China's purchasing volumes became variable. African supply filled gaps smoothly. Contracts shortened. Risk shifted downstream to farmers. The response within the United States was fragmented. Some argued for stronger trade intervention. Others called for increased subsidies, but these responses treated symptoms, not causes. Africa's rise and China's recalibration were not policy accidents. They were long-term decisions anchored in self-interest. Africa continued consolidating its position. Cotton-producing countries aligned standards to simplify cross-border trade. Shared infrastructure reduced costs. Knowledge exchange improved yields for the first time. African cotton benefited from coordination rather than competition among producers. China rewarded that coherence. Supply chains thrive on reliability. Africa offered growing reliability. The United States offered uncertainty. This inversion unsettled global buyers. For decades, American cotton was the safe choice. Now safety was associated with diversification. Relying heavily on one supplier appeared risky in a world of trade tension and policy volatility. China's recalibration influenced others. Manufacturers in Asia and the Middle East followed suit, sourcing more from Africa. Shipping routes adjusted accordingly. What began as a bilateral shift became a multilateral realignment. American farmers felt increasingly isolated. They were not failing due to inefficiency. Many remained among the most productive in the world, but productivity without demand yields surplus, not security. Storage costs rose, futures markets reflected pessimism, credit became conditional, the sense of inevitability weighed heavily. The phrase going broke no longer referred to immediate collapse. It described erosion, margins narrowing season after season, options disappearing quietly. Africa, by contrast, spoke in terms of momentum. Cotton revenues stabilized rural economies, processing jobs expanded, local consumption increased, export income supported currency stability. Cotton became a symbol of industrial ambition rather than colonial legacy. This reframing mattered. Africa no longer positioned itself as a raw material appendage to global markets. It positioned itself as a partner with leverage. China responded accordingly. Investment deepened beyond procurement, training programs expanded, technology transfer accelerated, Africa's cotton became embedded within broader industrial planning. The United States struggled to match that integrated approach. Policy discussions remained siloed, agriculture, trade, and industry moved on separate tracks. Farmers bore the consequences of fragmentation. Efforts to regain competitiveness faced structural constraints. Scaling down production risked insolvency, scaling up risked surplus, transitioning crops required capital many no longer had. The crisis exposed fragility. American cotton's dominance had masked vulnerability. Once demand diversified, resilience proved thinner than assumed. Africa's ascent also reshaped global narratives. For years, African agriculture was portrayed as inefficient and underdeveloped. The cotton shift challenged that narrative. Africa demonstrated that with coordination and investment, competitiveness followed. This success resonated beyond cotton. Other commodities adopted similar strategies. Value addition became policy priority. Export dependency declined. Africa's confidence grew. The United States observed this evolution with concern. Cotton had been a bellwether. Its decline signaled broader challenges. If cotton could be displaced, so could other commodities. The lesson was uncomfortable. Global markets were no longer structured around American centrality. China understood this reality early. Africa embraced it pragmatically. The United States confronted it reluctantly. As seasons turned, the cotton crisis became normalized. What once felt like shock became expectation. American farmers adjusted psychologically, if not financially. Some exited the industry, others consolidated land. A few found niche markets. The era of unquestioned dominance ended. Africa did not celebrate American decline. It focused on its own ascent. China did not gloat. It diversified further. The cotton market stabilized at a new equilibrium, one that reflected multipolar supply, shared influence, and diminished certainty. In that equilibrium, American cotton remained relevant but reduced. Africa became essential. China became insulated. The narrative of crushing American cotton was less about destruction and more about displacement. Displacement rooted in strategy rather than hostility. History would likely frame this period as inevitable. At the time, it felt sudden to those losing ground. American farmers learned a difficult truth: markets do not reward legacy, they reward alignment. Africa aligned with China's needs. China aligned with Africa's ambitions. The United States hesitated between preserving the past and confronting the future. Cotton made the choice visible. The outcome was not dictated by weather or fate. It was dictated by adaptation, and in that measure, Africa and China moved faster. The United States paid the price not because it lacked capacity, but because it assumed permanence. In global trade, permanence is an illusion. The cotton crisis proved it, and once that illusion dissolved, nothing could restore it. Here is a 45-second powerful hook, bold, urgent, and built for maximum impact. America thought cotton was untouchable, a legacy crop, a guaranteed export, a permanent advantage. Then Africa and China changed the math. While the United States debated trade and subsidies, Africa built supply chains and China locked in long-term demand. Contracts shifted, warehouses filled, prices collapsed, and American farmers were left watching markets disappear. This wasn't weather, it wasn't mismanagement, it was displacement. Cotton didn't fail because America stopped producing it. It failed because the world stopped depending on it. And when a country loses control of a crop that once defined its global power, the damage goes far beyond the fields.